It's the biggest blackmail attempt in the world. $100 billion of ransom. Just don't look too closely at the ransom note, because that is as dodgy as hell. Now, this blackmail racket is being run at the latest United Nations Climate Summit, this time in Egypt. And on the agenda, front and square, is how to guilt rich countries into handing over $100 billion to poor ones. The excuse? The supposed damage these rich countries are causing poor ones with their global warming emissions.
We all owe a debt of gratitude to activists and civil society organizations who have persistently demanded a space to discuss funding for loss and damage, and thus provided the impetus needed to bring this matter forward.
Naturally, with so much money at stake, the world's experts are rushing to Egypt to put their vast knowledge at the disposal of these climate grifters. Here, for instance, is the 11-year-old Indian Greta Thunberg, India's version. She's going, and so are race activists who've set up their tent at the conference to impart the wisdom of Indigenous people. And shouting from the sidelines are narcissistic climate activists gluing themselves to paintings, this time a Goya in Madrid, demanding action, while the real Greta Thunberg, outlining the real agenda here, gives capitalism the boot.
We are never going back to normal again, because normal was already a crisis. What we refer to as normal is an extreme system built on exploitation of people and planet. It is a system defined by colonialism, imperialism, oppression, and genocide by the so-called global north.
Yes, put the squeeze on those wicked capitalists, particularly in the rich north, you know, the rich white north. And forget the world's biggest emitter by far, communist China. They don't get a mention here, because this really is aimed instead at rich white capitalist nations. And this is why, of course, this global warming scam works so brilliantly. So for the privileged classes of the West, where God is dead, you know, global warming is, of course, the new religion. But for many of the poorer countries, it is their meal ticket, in fact. This is a brilliant earner. This is a way to chisel cash from the guilty West. That's why all these poor countries sign up for global warming. Money, money, money. And in this case, the $100 billion the United Nations says they are owed for the damage from the West. $100 billion the United Nations will control, of course. I mean, there's got to be something in it for them, doesn't there? But what damage exactly are we talking about? Because when you look at it, the world's in fact getting richer. People are living longer. We've never grown as much food. And your chances of dying in a climate-related disaster have never been lower. In part because we are rich enough and smart enough now to save ourselves and other people too. And all that good news is really because of this capitalism. And thank the West for that, for the Industrial Revolution, for scientific breakthroughs. So what is this damage that the West is supposed to pay for after it's already figured out how to feed and clothe the world? And here's where we get to the great con that the United Nations is pulling here. Its dodgy ransom note. This UN, and Greta Thunberg I'm sure would approve, is headed by a socialist from Portugal, a real global warming catastrophist. And he says, if you want to see this damage from global warming, you just need to look at the atoll islands of the Pacific. They are drowning.
In May, I went to the island nation of Tuvalu, where I witnessed an entire country fighting for its very existence against the rising seas.
Oh, those drowning Pacific islands of Tuvalu. Toodaloo, Tuvalu. The United Nations has been flogging that for more than a decade. Here's the representative for Tuvalu at the UN's 2010 climate conference, that infamous one at Copenhagen. This guy's actually Australian born, but doesn't matter. He's weeping for his supposedly drowning country.
I woke this morning and I was crying and that's not easy for a grown man to admit. The fate of my country rests in your hands.
Now, at the UN climate conference in Glasgow last year, the Tuvalu foreign minister, he was still at it. He actually filmed his speech up to his waist in seawater, as if the seas had already risen so much that washed away his office.
We must take bold alternative action today to secure tomorrow. Whaftailasi, Tuvalu Modetua.
But the sad fact is, it's my melancholy duty to tell you, that anything the UN says about global warming is likely to be a lie or an exaggeration or a half-truth. What the UN says there, what people say at the UN. In this case, its blackmail racket is based on a clear lie. In fact, as even Australia's left-wing national broadcaster finally admitted last year, after years of flogging the Tuvalu is drowning story, well, it's not. It's actually growing. In the 4 decades to 2014, Tuvalu's total land area actually grew by 73 hectares, or 2.9% of its total territory. And that's based on research from the University of Auckland. And it's not just Tuvalu that's growing. I mean, these atoll island nations that the UN is using this blackmail racket are all far more likely to be growing, not sinking. Around the Pacific, Auckland University researchers have found 43% of islands that it studied have actually grown. Another 43% were stable in size. Just 14, 1-4, got smaller. 14% got smaller. And a French study found the same sort of thing. And so did the most recent study just last year of 220-odd atolls in both the Indian and Pacific Islands. From 2000, the year 2000, their total land area had grown by more than 61 square kilometres, or more than 6% of their total size. Well, that's not bad. Now, part of that, of course, was doing things like building seawalls or reclaiming land, but part of it too was natural growth. Waves just dumping sand and shells on the islands, as they've done for millennia. But have you heard any of that good news? Hey, wait, stop, the islands aren't drowning, they're growing. Have you heard any of that from the United Nations? Have you heard that from many in the mainstream media? Have you heard that from Al Gore, who actually started this whole fake news about Pacific Islands sinking, climate refugees actually fleeing to New Zealand? Totally false. You go, but, you hear, but. Climate activists, they don't want to hear this truth. But, cyclones. These islands face more cyclones, devastating. But again, false. The United Nations own Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says no. And when you actually look at the cyclone data for Australia, for instance, on the edge of both the Pacific and the Indian Oceans, you see not just fewer cyclones over the past 50 years, but fewer severe ones. And it makes you think, wow, could global warming in fact be good for us? I mean, count them up. Fewer cyclones, that's good. More food, even better. Fewer people dying in climate-related disasters. And for this, the West has actually got to say sorry and pay $100 billion in reparations, says the UN. What a scam. What a total scam.